The merchant republics of medieval Europe kept two sets of records. The first was the ledger presented to trade partners, tax collectors, and occasionally to kings who needed to understand why their requests for credit had been denied. The second was the one that survived in private family archives, the correspondence between partners, the cipher letters carried by trusted couriers, the margin notes that named the real counterparties behind transactions recorded under fictional company names. For 3 centuries, from roughly the middle of the 13th century to the close of the 16th, the families who controlled the great banking houses of Venice sat at the intersection of those two records. They did not merely profit from Europe's wars. They structured the financial terms on which those wars were fought, chose which monarchs would receive credit and on what conditions, and collected from both the winning and the losing party long after the armies had gone home. The standard account of this period presents the Venetian merchant elite as traders, brilliant, opportunistic, occasionally ruthless, but ultimately responsive to market conditions beyond their control. The financial record shows something more deliberate. It shows an institutional architecture built across generations, designed not to follow power, but to govern the conditions under which power could be exercised. To read that record properly requires understanding what kind of institution Venice actually was, because the city that appears in popular histories, the serene maritime republic of carnival masks and canal reflections, is almost entirely absent from the ledgers, the dispatch books, and the Senate deliberations that constitute the real archive of Venetian power. If this record has your attention, hit the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. The geography of who is paying attention to this matters. Venice, in the late 13th century, was not a city in any conventional sense. It was a commercial republic governed by a merchant oligarchy operating through a set of interlocking institutions, the Doge, the Great Council, the Senate, the Council of Ten, that had been refined over 2 centuries to concentrate decision-making in the hands of the families whose names appeared in the Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book of Venetian nobility. Entry into that book was controlled. The families listed there were not simply wealthy. They were the permanent governing class of a state whose foreign policy, military commitments, and commercial treaties were all instruments of the same underlying objective: the protection and expansion of the trading networks that generated the capital on which the Republic ran. What distinguished Venice from its rivals, Genoa, Florence, the emerging banking houses of the Rhineland, was the degree to which its financial operations were systematically embedded in its political structure. A Florentine banker like the Bardi or the Peruzzi operated through private family firms that negotiated with states as external actors. A Venetian house operated through the Republic itself. The Senate voted on credit extensions to foreign monarchs. The Council of Ten reviewed correspondence with counterparties in Constantinople, Alexandria, and London. The line between private banking interest and state financial policy was not blurred in Venice. It was, for most practical purposes, non-existent. The men who sat in the Senate and approved a military expenditure were, in a significant number of cases, the same men who held the bonds that financed it and whose family agents in Bruges and Cairo would process the exchange letters that moved the capital. This was not a conflict of interest in the modern regulatory sense. It was the design of the system. The mechanism that made this system operational was the exchange letter, the littera di cambio, which allowed merchants to transfer value across borders without moving coin. A Venetian house with agents in London, Bruges, Constantinople, and Cairo could accept a deposit in Venice, issue a letter of exchange payable in London at a specified future date, and use the time differential between the issuance and the settlement to generate what was, in practice, an interest-bearing loan. The Church had prohibited usury, the lending of money at interest, and the exchange letter was the technical instrument by which that prohibition was systematically circumvented. The transaction was framed as a currency exchange, not a loan. The profit was described as the gain from the difference in exchange rates between cities, not as interest on capital. Every ecclesiastical authority in Europe understood what the instrument actually was. The practice continued because the monarchs, popes, and princes who needed access to credit found the arrangement more useful than its prohibition. The Venetian houses did not invent the exchange letter. They standardized it, systematized it, and embedded it in a network of correspondent agents, so dense and so reliable that by the early 14th century, the financial infrastructure of European sovereign lending ran, in significant part, through Venice. A king in Paris who needed silver to pay mercenaries in Milan could receive it within weeks, routed through a Venetian correspondent in Lyon, settled through a letter drawn on a Venetian agent in Genoa, with the exchange rate fixed at the last champagne fair. The mechanism was invisible to anyone who was not inside it. That invisibility was not incidental. It was the condition on which the whole edifice depended. The first major test of this system came not in Europe, but in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, ostensibly organized to recover Jerusalem, instead sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and Venice's largest trading partner. The historical account of that diversion attributes it to a combination of Crusader debt, Venetian opportunism, and the political intrigues of Byzantine succession. What the financial record shows is more structured. The crusade had been contracted to Venice in 1201. The Doge at the time, Enrico Dandolo, negotiated the transport agreement on terms the Crusader leadership could not meet, a fleet of ships for 33,000 men at a cost of 85,000 silver marks. When the Crusaders arrived in Venice in 1202, they could muster only 11,000 men and 33,500 marks. They were in default before the campaign began. Dandolo's solution was not to cancel the contract, it was to restructure it. Venice would accept the outstanding debt in exchange for Crusader military assistance in retaking the Dalmatian port of Zara, which had been seized by Hungary. The papacy explicitly forbade the attack. The Crusaders attacked anyway. Zara fell in November 1202. The debt was partially settled. The crusade continued, now redirected toward Constantinople, where a claimant to the Byzantine throne had promised financial rewards to the Crusaders in exchange for their military support. That promise, like the original transport contract, could not be honored. When it became clear that Constantinople could not pay what its ruler had guaranteed, the Crusaders did what creditor states have always feared: they seized the asset itself. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 produced an enormous transfer of wealth to Venice: the horses of St. Mark, the Palla d'Oro, commercial monopolies, territorial concessions across the Aegean, and established Venice as the dominant commercial power in the eastern Mediterranean for the next century. The financial architecture of the transaction had been designed by the Venetian Senate. The military force that executed it was European Christendom. What the standard account calls a diversion, the financial record describes as a restructuring. By the early 14th century, the Venetian houses had formalized what their Florentine counterparts were also developing: sovereign lending at scale. The difference was that where the Florentine houses, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciaiuoli, lent to monarchs as private firms and bore the full risk of sovereign default, the Venetian houses operated through the Republic's Monte Vecchio, the Old Mountain, the consolidated public debt instrument established in 1262. The Monte Vecchio allowed the Venetian state to borrow from its own citizens by issuing government bonds, Prestiti, that paid a fixed annual return and could be traded on the secondary market. This created, for the first time in European history, a functioning market in sovereign debt. The bonds had a face value. They traded at discounts depending on the perceived creditworthiness of the Republic. Wealthy Venetians were required to purchase them during military emergencies at rates determined by the assessed value of their property. What looked like compulsory taxation was, in practice, a mechanism for converting private wealth into state credit while maintaining the fiction of voluntary participation. The families who held the largest Prestiti positions were the same families who sat on the Senate committees that authorized military expenditures. They voted to fund campaigns, issued the bonds that financed them, collected the interest from the Republic's tax revenues, and profited from the commercial opportunities that successful campaigns produced. The alignment of private financial interest with state military policy was not incidental to the system. It was the system. The Prestiti market also produced something that the political histories of the period rarely discuss: a class of Venetian citizens whose primary interest was in the Republic's creditworthiness rather than its territorial expansion. A merchant family holding large positions in government bonds had a direct financial incentive to ensure that Venice honored its debt obligations even in periods of military reversal, because default would destroy the value of the very instruments through which they held their wealth. This created a structural conservatism in Venetian fiscal policy that was unusual by the standards of the period. Where other medieval states regularly repudiated debts when the political circumstances made it convenient, Venice maintained a record of debt service that became, in itself, a form of financial infrastructure. The Republic's creditworthiness was not merely a byproduct of fiscal discipline, it was an asset that had been deliberately constructed, maintained across generations, and priced into the exchange letters its agents wrote in every commercial city in Europe. By the middle of the 14th century, the Venetian government's ability to borrow at competitive rates depended on an institutional reputation for debt service that the private families had a direct personal interest in maintaining. The public and private interests had been designed to coincide. The Ottoman question brought this architecture to its most consequential test. For most of the 15th century, Venice maintained simultaneous diplomatic and commercial relationships with the Ottoman Empire, while also organizing and partially financing the coalition resistance to Ottoman expansion in the Balkans and the Aegean. This was not regarded as contradictory. The Senate debated both positions in the same session. Letters to Constantinople requesting the renewal of commercial privileges sat in the archive alongside funding authorizations for anti-Ottoman military leagues. The logic was not cynical in any simple sense. Venice needed Ottoman markets to survive commercially. Venice also needed Ottoman expansion to remain manageable enough that those markets stayed accessible. The financial interest was a permanent hedge. Credit extended to both the expansion and the containment of the same power. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the response of the Venetian Senate was to send a condolence mission to the new sultan and open negotiations for the restoration of its trading rights in the city it had just watched fall. The Prestiti market barely moved. Within 3 years, the Republic had secured a treaty that restored most of its commercial privileges in Ottoman territory. The financial relationship had survived the political catastrophe because it had been structured, from the beginning, to outlast political outcomes. This was not a unique episode. It was a demonstration of the system operating as intended. The wars of Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries brought the Venetian banking network into direct contact with the emerging financial powers of the north, the Fugger family of Augsburg, the emerging Lyon fairs, the Antwerp exchange. Charles V of France invaded Italy in 1494. The Italian states, Venice among them, organized the League of Venice in 1495 to force his withdrawal. The subsequent decades of conflict, the War of the League of Cambrai, the Italian wars that continued until the Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559, required continuous sovereign credit on a scale that no single banking house could provide alone. The Venetian contribution to this market operated through a specific mechanism. The Republic's galley system, the state-owned and state-operated merchant fleet, functioned as a financial asset as well as a commercial one. The right to freight space on the galleys was auctioned annually. The revenues were pledged against state debt. The merchant families who held the freight contracts also held the Prestiti. The same capital that financed Venice's wars also financed its commerce, and the two were structured so that a disruption to one would threaten the other, which meant the Senate had a permanent institutional incentive to maintain the conditions under which both could operate. When a military campaign disrupted the galley routes, the revenue pledged against the Prestiti was directly affected. The bondholders in the Senate had a measurable financial stake in the speed of diplomatic resolution. The financial architecture produced a specific kind of political behavior that looks, in the standard account, like prudence or commercial instinct. It was both of those things. It was also the output of a mechanism whose parameters had been set in advance. Across the Alps, the Fuggers were developing a parallel architecture. Jakob Fugger, whose house had financed the election of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and would go on to finance the election of Charles V, was building the first true multinational banking firm in European history, with operations spanning Augsburg, Venice, Antwerp, Lisbon, and the silver mines of Tyrol and Hungary. The relationship between the Fuggers and the Venetian houses was not competitive in the modern sense. It was correspondent. The two networks shared counterparties, coordinated exchange rates at the great fairs of Lyon and Champagne, and operated as complementary nodes in the same continental credit system. When a monarch needed to raise capital quickly, the practical answer was often a syndicate drawn from both networks, with the Venetian houses providing access to Mediterranean trade revenues and the Fuggers providing access to the mining profits and imperial tax receipts of the north. The interest on these loans flowed in both directions. The risk was distributed, the control was not. A document that survives in the Fugger family correspondence, portions of which were published in the early 20th century in a multi-volume German-language collection and have received almost no attention in English-language scholarship, contains a letter from the Venetian Grimani house to their Augsburg contacts, dated to approximately 1509, the year of the League of Cambrai's formation against Venice. The letter discusses the terms of a credit facility for one of the French participants in the League, routed through Lyon, and notes that the revenue stream pledged as collateral runs in part through Venetian-controlled trade infrastructure. The Grimani are proposing to structure a loan to a party militarily arrayed against Venice, secured in part by revenues that Venice controls. The letter closes with a passage indicating that the political situation should not be allowed to compromise the credit relationship, as the credit relationship will outlast the political situation. It did. The League of Cambrai dissolved within 8 years. The Grimani correspondent relationship with Augsburg continued for another generation. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this one. What the financial record of this period shows most clearly is not a series of individual transactions but a structural pattern. The houses that survived the Italian wars, the Reformation, and the subsequent fragmentation of the European political order were not the ones that backed eventual winners. Most of them backed multiple parties simultaneously. The Grimani of Venice held trading privileges from both the Ottoman Sultan and the Habsburg Emperor. The Contarini, one of the oldest families in the Golden Book, maintained correspondent relationships with Florentine houses that were financing the papacy, while Venice was formally at war with Rome. The Pisani Bank extended credit to French clients in Lyon, at the same time that Venice was formally allied with Spain against France. These were not aberrations or betrayals of political loyalty. They were the operational logic of a system built on the premise that capital has no sovereign, that credit is the one instrument that survives regime change, and that the family controlling access to credit controls the terms on which power is exercised, not the outcomes, which are determined by armies and accidents, but the terms. Who can fight? For how long? On what conditions of repayment? This logic was not articulated in any single document. It was embedded in the training of every factor who managed a Venetian correspondent account, in the standard clauses of every exchange letter, in the risk assessment that determined which sovereign requests for credit were approved and which were declined without explanation. The political histories of the Italian wars discuss alliances, campaigns, territorial settlements, dynastic marriages. They note the financial demands of the period without examining the structure of who provided the financing or what that structure produced. The financial record, read against those political histories, shows a consistent pattern. The same families appear on multiple sides of the same conflict. Extending credit through correspondent relationships that crossed political lines the official record presents as absolute. The reason this pattern is not visible in the standard account is not that it was secret. The exchange letters circulated through dozens of cities. The correspondent relationships were known to the merchants who participated in them. The pattern is invisible in the standard account because the standard account was not written to follow capital. It was written to follow armies, dynasties, and the political decisions of named monarchs. Those are real and important things. They are not, on their own, a complete account of what happened or why. The Venetian system began to fracture in the mid-16th century, and the fracture came not from political defeat, but from a structural shift in the geography of capital. The great Portuguese and Spanish trading routes that bypassed the eastern Mediterranean, the Cape route to the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic route to the Americas, were redirecting the commodity flows on which Venetian commercial supremacy depended. Pepper, spices, silk, the goods whose markup had financed the Prestiti and funded the galley system, were increasingly reaching European markets through Lisbon and Seville rather than through Venice and Alexandria. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, celebrated in Venice as a decisive victory over Ottoman naval power, came too late and meant too little in commercial terms. The Ottoman fleet was rebuilt within 2 years. The spice trade did not return. What Lepanto actually marked was the final major deployment of the galley system, the last moment when the state-owned fleet that had underwritten Venetian financial power for 3 centuries was still a primary instrument of military force. After 1571, the galley gave way to the galleon. Atlantic powers built the new warships. The financial architecture that had been built around the galley network became progressively less relevant to the new geography of European capital. The Venetian response to this contraction was, in several respects, an admission. The Senate authorized a series of banking reforms in the 1580s that acknowledged what the private correspondents of the merchant houses had been saying for a decade, that the correspondent network was under stress, that exchange rates at the Antwerp and Lyon fairs were increasingly set by northern houses without meaningful Venetian input, and that the Prestiti market was no longer performing its original function as a reliable mechanism for converting private wealth into state credit. The Banco della Piazza di Rialto, established in 1587, was the Republic's attempt to create a formal public banking institution that could perform the clearing and settlement functions the private houses were increasingly unable to guarantee. It was, in institutional terms, an acknowledgement of structural decline dressed as administrative modernization. The Barbaro family papers, held in the Venetian State Archive and partially catalogued in the 19th century, contain a memorandum from the same period describing the Lyon fair business as no longer worth the capital required to maintain a competitive position. The Antwerp market, the document notes, is controlled by factors whose principles are in Augsburg and Amsterdam. The correspondent relationships that had given Venice access to northern credit markets were, by the end of the 16th century, relationships between unequal parties. Venice was the junior partner in a system it had built. What the Venetian banking archive shows, when read against the standard political history of the period, is a distinction that the political account is structurally unable to make, the distinction between who won the wars and who collected on them. The War of the League of Cambrai, in which virtually every major European power united against Venice from 1508 to 1516, ended with Venice diplomatically restored and territorially reduced, but financially intact. The Prestiti had been serviced throughout. The correspondent network had continued to operate. The galley contracts had been renegotiated on terms that preserved the revenue stream. Venice had not won the war in any military sense. It had survived it on financial terms that its opponents had been unable to match, in part because the Venetian houses held portions of the debt that several of those opponents had issued to finance the campaign against Venice. The credit extended to the League's members had, in some cases, been structured through Venetian correspondents in Lyon and Bruges. The interest payments continued regardless of the political outcome. The long consequence of this system is visible not in Venice, whose commercial supremacy was effectively ended by the close of the 16th century, but in the institutional forms it pioneered. The public debt market that the Monte Vecchio introduced in 1262 became the model for the Amsterdam Exchange Bank of 1609, the Bank of England of 1694, and the sovereign bond markets that still function as the primary mechanism through which modern states finance military expenditure. The exchange letter that the Venetian houses standardized became the bill of exchange, then the promissory note, then the instrument that underlies modern foreign exchange markets. The correspondent banking network that Venice built across the Mediterranean and into northern Europe became the model for the clearing networks that still process international transactions today. The specific families are gone, or dispersed into the broader European financial elite that emerged from the century of wars after 1560. The names changed, the institutional architecture did not. It was carried forward by the Amsterdam houses that replaced Venice as the center of European credit, then by the London merchant banks that replaced Amsterdam, then by the institutions that replaced those. At each transition, the mechanism was refined but not discarded, because the mechanism worked, not for the populations whose wars it financed, who paid in blood and debt and taxation for campaigns whose financial terms they never saw, but for the families and institutions that structured those terms and collected the interest regardless of who won the field. The Venetian bankers did not create European warfare. They created the financial conditions under which European warfare could be sustained far longer, at far greater scale, than the revenues of any individual monarch could have supported. That is the record the ledger contains. It is not a record of villainy in any simple sense. It is a record of institutional design, a design that has been running, in successively updated forms, for 750 years. The specific innovations that Venice contributed to that design are not matters of scholarly dispute. The public bond market, the standardized bill of exchange, the correspondent banking network operating across political boundaries, each of these has been traced by economic historians directly to Venetian institutional practice, and each of them survived the commercial collapse of Venice itself to be adopted, refined, and expanded by the financial powers that succeeded it. What has not been fully integrated into the standard historical account is the relationship between those financial innovations and the specific military and political outcomes they made possible. The bond market did not merely finance Venetian wars. It created a class of creditors with a structural interest in the continuation of the state, which is a different thing from loyalty, and a more reliable one. The bill of exchange did not merely facilitate trade. It created a mechanism for moving sovereign credit across political boundaries without the knowledge or consent of the political authorities on either side. The correspondent network did not merely connect merchants. It created an information infrastructure whose operators knew, in real time, what no government in Europe knew: the creditworthiness of every significant sovereign borrower on the continent, the current state of the exchange rates in a dozen cities, and the identity of the counterparties behind transactions recorded under other names. That information was the real asset. The lending was the product it made possible. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. The admission that this record exists and that it differs from the standard account has come, in fragments, from unlikely sources. The Venetian State Archive, the Archivio di Stato di Venezia, holds one of the most complete documentary records of any medieval and early modern state in Europe. Its deliberation books, the Deliberazioni of the Senate and the Maggior Consiglio, record votes, debates, and policy decisions with a precision that has no parallel in the governmental records of France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire for the same period. Scholars who have worked with those records, Frederick Lane in the mid-20th century, most extensively, and in more recent decades the economic historians working from the perspective of the new institutional economics, have noted consistently that the gap between the political narrative of Venetian history and the financial record is not a gap that results from missing documents. The documents are there. They record what the Senate decided, who voted, and what the revenue projections were. The gap results from the persistent tendency of political history to treat financial mechanisms as background rather than as the primary substance of what was decided. A Senate vote to extend credit to a foreign monarch is recorded as a diplomatic decision. The financial terms that made that decision possible, the bond issue, the exchange letter network, the pledged revenues, those appear in a separate series of documents that historians trained in political and diplomatic history rarely consult alongside the deliberation books. The two sets of records have rarely been read together. When they are, the gap between the official account and the financial record becomes visible in the margins. The family that most clearly embodies the operational logic of the Venetian system across the full 3 centuries under discussion is the Grimani, whose archive, partly held in Venice and partly dispersed through the collections of institutions in Vienna and London, covers the period from the mid-13th century through the early 17th. The Grimani produced 3 doges, 2 cardinals, a patriarch of Aquileia, and a succession of procurators of San Marco. They held Prestiti, they financed galley contracts, they maintained correspondence in Constantinople, Alexandria, Beirut, Antwerp, and Lyon, simultaneously, across periods when Venice was at war with the Ottoman Empire, at war with the Habsburgs, and at war with the papacy. The Grimani archive does not contain a single document that articulates the strategic logic of simultaneously maintaining credit relationships across political lines. It does not need to. The pattern is visible in the transaction records themselves, in the letters of exchange drawn on parties in cities controlled by powers with which Venice was nominally at war, in the correspondent accounts maintained through periods of political rupture, in the debt instruments that continued to generate interest payments regardless of which flag flew over the port through which the collateral goods moved. The logic was not written down because it did not need to be. It was the operating assumption of every factor and agent the House employed. This is the mechanism that the standard account of European political and military history is not designed to reveal. The history of European warfare between 1204 and 1560 is, in the conventional telling, a history of dynastic ambition, religious conflict, territorial competition, and the slow emergence of the modern state system. All of those things are real. None of them is the complete account. Behind the diplomatic correspondence, behind the military campaigns, behind the peace treaties and the dynastic marriages, there was a financial architecture that determined which conflicts could be sustained and which could not, which monarchs had the credit to field armies and which did not, and which institutions collected the interest on the debt that made the whole system run. That architecture was built in Venice, in the years between 1262 and 1587, by the families whose names appear in the Golden Book, and whose ledgers are still held, in significant part, in the archive on the Frari Canal. The wars they financed were real. The men who died in them were real. The financial mechanism that made those wars possible, and that continued to generate returns for the houses that structured them long after the fighting had ended, that mechanism is the record the standard account was not designed to contain. The evidence does not require invention. It requires reading the documents that have always existed alongside the documents that are routinely cited, and recognizing that what the financial record shows and what the political account claims are not always the same thing. In the case of the Venetian banking system and its role in 3 centuries of European warfare, they are almost never the same thing. The ledger is still there. It has always been there. The exchange letters are catalogued. The Prestiti registers are intact. The Senate deliberations are bound and shelved in sequence. The Grimani correspondence survives in 3 separate archives on 2 continents. None of it is hidden. All of it is accessible to anyone who reads Italian and has a reader's card for the Archivio di Stato. What changes is not the availability of the record. What changes is whether anyone reading the political history of this period is willing to sit down with the financial record beside it and ask what the 2 versions of events, placed together, actually show.